Well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're talking about class and inequality. This particular subject is important to understand, certainly, when it comes to the modern take on culture, especially Western cultures, but this can also be seen throughout the world. So it's important to understand how does wealth get circulated? How do different systems organize themselves to allow the distribution of wealth? Um, and then what happens when that wealth is um, sort of distributed unfairly or unequally? So let's talk a little bit about that. So, inequality in human culture. Inequality and class systems are a part of every modern culture. And this is true. Any time that you go to a city, any country where you have sort of modern culture, you're going to have class systems, right? And those class systems are going to be divided up between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor. We see inequality expressed in different ways. Whether or not it's through wealth, the actual possession of money, of resources, power, who has the ability to control those resources, resources themselves, privileges, who has access to things like good education, good food, good places to live, status within a society, who's going to be listened to, who's going to have the ear of uh, the important people. And then, of course, as I said before, education. Education being one of those uh, gatekeeping systems, whether or not you can get a job with your level of education, whether or not your education is going to help you deal with things like healthcare, right? And knowing the difference between eating good foods and bad foods, and knowing how to have good hygiene, and all of those kinds of things can be incorporated into education. They can also be expressed through things like race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and religious ideology. These can all have um, different impacts on whether or not you're going to have access to resources. Now, if we go back in time, uh, prior to sort of the beginnings of modern society and culture, um, we see that most people lived in sort of egalitarian situations where you didn't have large populations of people. Most people, before we started founding the earliest city states, um, lived in small bands, right? And a band of people usually uh, was probably in the range of about anywhere from 20 to 200 people. Okay, so relatively small populations, oftentimes nomadic. These folks were moving around seasonally from different places. And it really isn't until a few places that were pretty good at having resources year round that we start seeing people settle into those places and not needing to be nomadic to find those resources. So, a lot of these early cultures, being primarily egalitarian, um, share their resources, share the workload, right? Everybody contributes, everybody benefits. Okay. And in this case, everyone um, got to experience this, and there's very little hierarchy, right? You don't have people that are usually in charge all of the time. A lot of egalitarian societies might have special leaders in which, say, you're the best person at fishing. Well, then you might be the fishing expedition leader, right? If you're the best at hunting, then you might be the leader for the hunting group. But as soon as you come back to the community, your status is that, yeah, you might be the best hunter, but you might not be the best at making, decisions for everyone else on everything else. So it becomes very situational. Um, and this is also important um, because at different life stages, you're going to contribute more or less, right? If you are young and energetic and have the capability of going out and harvesting or hunting, doing lots of labor, you are going to contribute more to society than what you would receive. When you get older, you're going to consume more than what you contribute as far as like resources are concerned. But because you already sort of put in your time, you're going to benefit later on. So it all sort of balances out. This concept is called, or is based on this idea of reciprocity. Okay, so everybody contributes, everyone benefits when they practice reciprocity. Um, it's how we look at the resources in our community, how we give out resources, and then collect something in return, right? Not everyone is going to go hunting or go harvesting. Some people are going to work with textiles. They're the ones that are going to be working from inside the camp, and they're going to be doing the things in camp. Well, they are also contributing, and it's all sort of equalized. Um, this also works well when dealing with other communities, sharing resources and building alliances. So if one group runs out of resources and another group has extra, then they are willing to share because maybe next year um, uh, their resources might be low and your resources might be high. And you, again, do this sort of process of reciprocity in which, again, everybody contributes and everybody benefits. As I said, societies are often formed into bands of people, small groups of folks that are highly mobile due to their need to hunt and gather. um, However, sometimes, depending on the region in which they're living, they might conduct things like pastoralism or horticulture. Pastoralism being having small herds of animals. So, depending on what part of the world you might live in, you might have pigs, you might have llamas, you might have horses or cattle, sheep, goats, right? Usually smaller herds that travel with you. And then you might have horticulture. The difference between horticulture and agriculture is horticulture is usually small, like gardens, usually with a very um, like seasonal approach to those gardens, and oftentimes left. So you might land in an area and you might spend a couple of months in that part of the country before you move on to another location where you might grow or you might cultivate a small garden in that area, and then leave it to go back to nature when you move on to the next place that you're going to live. And agriculture being a typically a permanent um, farming location, right? These are usually planted farms, specific crops that are cultivated every year in a similar process. and those lands are oftentimes tended to on a regular basis. You usually see agriculture when you have settled societies, right? These are communities that are no longer um, nomadic. So after um, egalitarian societies, we start seeing ranked societies. Okay, so these are usually with larger populations. So if we look at tribes, tribes are usually made up of multiple bands of people. So you might have everything from a few hundred, possibly to a few thousand individuals. Um, and in these systems, we still see a system of like redistribution, right? This is where we collect the resources from everybody and then redistribute them fairly equally to everyone, including some of the hierarchical positions that might be created, right? So in this case, you might end up having someone like a chief, some sort of person in overall control of a society, um, but they still have a very egalitarian sort of process in which those resources are collected all together and then redistributed. Um, within ranked societies, we don't see a lot of change when it comes to prestige and status. These systems are usually developed around heredity. So you are born into whatever status you're going to have for the rest of your life. Now, prestige can be a little bit different when it comes to status. Prestige is usually something that can be changed based on what you can contribute, right? So you can gain more prestige if you're capable of contributing more, but that won't necessarily change your status. Your status is usually um, what it is when you are born into that area. So yeah, a lot of times any sort of change in your social status is nearly impossible. Um, we have a chief, and in this case, what happens is that they oftentimes are accumulating those resources that everyone brings in. Um, and because of their level of status, they are more concerned with sort of like the politics of a community. But one of the things that they do is instead of like how, if you think about our society, the more wealth, the more toys, the more stuff that you acquire, you keep them, right? Whoever has the most toys wins. In this case, it's actually the opposite. They gain prestige not only within their own society, but within their neighbors by redistributing those resources, right? And it helps them to sort of create um, relationships and alliances with those other communities, uh, so that if there is a issue in the future, that you would again be able to access those neighbors and gain access to their resources. If they've got plentiful resources and you don't, then they will share with you, and vice versa. When you've got more resources and they don't, you give to them. Um, some of these communities will practice things like hunting and gathering, but also begin to do agriculture and horticulture along with pastoralism. Uh, Chiefdoms, which are larger than tribes, are oftentimes very sedentary, which means that they create a single community and build around that one location. So they're not seasonal; they stay in one location and build up their resources. And this is when we start seeing large agricultural practices engaged. So you've got, um, uh, we start seeing farmers going out and creating more and more resources that become available to to the society. This is interesting because as you start having agriculture, you start seeing a shift in uh, uh, occupations and the variety of occupations that you can have within a society. Because with agriculture, we start seeing that there's more food that one person can create, which means that not everybody has to be going out searching for food, right? They can start working on other occupations instead of just food gathering, which is usually the case with nomadic cultures. Nomadic cultures, everyone is out looking for those resources because they need to be able to have enough resources for everyone to survive, which also helps to keep those communities low in numbers, right? Because if you're searching an area, depending on how many resources that area has, can determine the size of your group, right? But if you have control over that land and can grow those large farms, all of a sudden one farmer can create enough food for 20 people. Well, then all of a sudden you've got 20 people that can start focusing on other types of occupations, whether or not it becomes, you start having pottery and uh, ceramics and textiles, and that's when you start seeing the beginnings of organized religion, because now you've got people that can spend more time doing those kinds of activities. So you start seeing more stratified communities and more diverse occupations. Um, an interesting thing that we sort of still benefit from in this form of redistribution, if we look to the Northwest and a lot of Northwest um, native communities, they conducted what was called the potlatch, right? And the potlatch was a process in which they would invite uh, other tribes and bands together, and they would have sort of like a big gathering, a big party, and that community that did the inviting would just start handing out resources, right? Maybe they had an abundance of food. Maybe they had an abundance of furs or pelts or tools. What they would do is they would invite their neighbors over and say, hey, we've got all this stuff, we would like to give it away. And then that's what they would do. We sort of do something similar in the potluck, right? We have potlucks in which everybody contributes, right? Everybody brings a dish to a gathering, and we share those resources, right? So that's where that term potluck comes from, is this native term of potlatch. Um, and this is something that is uh, I think really important for societies, as most cultures have this sort of way of working within the community in giving out resources, sharing of resources to create that that sense of community, that sense of relationships and alliances. If I have enough resources, then I'm going to share with you. And if you have enough resources, you're going to share with me. And it creates those long term bonds, right? And it helps to also gain prestige within that society. If you have a lot of resources and you give out those resources, all of a sudden you get a bump in prestige and status within the communities. So, what other ways do we distribute wealth amongst ourselves? I think this is an interesting question because we do this quite often within our own society. So, what I want you to do is pause this for a moment. I want you to write down and think about ways that we redistribute resources. And this can sometimes be kind of a tricky question because, when we talk about redistribution, um, it doesn't usually fit into our sort of normal ideas of resources. But we do this in different ways that help our community. Um, so I want you to pause, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some different ways that we do this. Okay, so let's talk about some different ways that we redistribute wealth amongst ourselves. So, a couple of things to consider. One would be there are a number of yearly activities that we do that helps to distribute wealth amongst ourselves. Um, for example, birthdays. Okay, your birthday. We do birthday parties, right? Everybody comes together. You invite your friends and family over, and people will bring gifts. And say you have 10 people come over to your birthday party, each one of them brings you a gift, and you just gained more wealth, right? The same thing could be done for things like Christmas, right? You go out, you buy gifts for other people in your community, and then they give those gifts back, right, in exchange. Now, the reason why that we can do this and why it's kind of important is that at different stages in our lives we have the capability of giving more or giving less, right? Say you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of resources, so the gifts that you give usually don't have uh, a lot of material value, let's say. But the other folks in your family or in your network, they're doing a lot more well off, and they give you nicer gifts. So the exchange might not be balanced, right? But that's not necessarily the point. So that's saying in a couple of years you got yourself a really good job, you're making a lot of money, and you remember that the people in your circle gave you more, right? They gave you some really nice gifts, especially when you needed it. You're going to go back and give them nice gifts when you get that chance, right? Because maybe one of them fell on hard times and they don't have as many resources. Now you're capable of giving back to those resources or giving back to those who haven't gotten there yet, right? And help them along. So things like birthdays and uh, Christmas, things like that, are one of those ways. We also have things like weddings, right? Weddings are one of those times when you invite a bunch of people. You might bring like 30 or 50 people to your wedding, and weddings are typically fairly expensive. But in this process, people are also bringing gifts, right? And helping out with the newlyweds and helping them to gain some resources, right? One of the things that's common to give at a wedding is like a new set of pots and pans, uh, something to help with the homemaking. And you start seeing this again, distribution of wealth. New family might not have a lot of resources, but if all your friends and family come together and give you gifts, right, that helps with uh, moving forward and creating that life that you want to have. Same thing can be done with like baby showers, right? Helping out with the expense of having a child. And so you can get those resources and the help and the education that you might need from those who have already engaged in this process. So we oftentimes see that there are different ways in which we redistribute wealth, right? Not always equally between people, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is typically to create those relationships, um, and to help as much as you can when you can, because you never know when you're going to need that help yourself. Okay. Uh, what we're going to do is we're going to pause there and we're going to start up with the next portion of this lecture. We'll talk to you in a minute.